Walk into almost any STEM classroom in the world: engineering, physics, chemistry, mathematics. Now look at how students are assessed. Chances are you'll see something very familiar: problem sets, timed exams, final test at the end of the term. In fact, if you compared today's STEM assessment practices with those almost 70 years ago, the differences might be surprisingly small, which is curious because the technology surrounding education has changed dramatically. We now have learning platforms, simulations, automated grading systems, and artificial intelligence tools capable of analyzing student work. So why do so many STEM courses still rely on the same assessment structures? Why does evaluation change so much more slowly than instruction? Welcome back to the EdTech Curio Cabinet. Hello again, I'm Christina, the Curio Steward. And if you listen to our first episode, you'll know that this podcast explores patterns in education through 4 lenses. First, the artifact, the specific tool or practice we're looking at. Second, the pattern, where we've seen something like it before. Then the paradox, the unexpected insight hiding inside the story. And finally, the signal, what it might tell us about the future of learning. Today's Curio is something that quietly shapes almost every student's academic experience: assessment, specifically STEM assessment. Because while teaching methods have evolved in many ways, the way we measure learning has remained remarkably stable. Now, if you've taken a STEM course, you probably remember the structure. Student attends a lecture, we work through problem sets, maybe complete some lab work, and then at certain points during the semester, they're evaluated through tests or exams. These assessments usually involve solving problems under time pressure, sometimes with calculators, sometimes with formula sheets, sometimes entirely from memory. The format is familiar because it's been refined over many decades. And to be fair, the structure exists for good reasons. STEM subjects require students to demonstrate problem-solving ability, not just factual recall. Instructors need to know whether students can apply concepts, can they manipulate equations, and reason through complex scenarios. So timed exams and structured assignments became a practical way to evaluate those specific abilities. But if we look around today's learning environments, something interesting becomes apparent. The technology supporting instruction has changed dramatically, yet the core structure of assessment often looks almost identical to what students experienced generations ago. Which leads us to the pattern. Throughout the history of education, teaching methods have evolved more quickly than evaluation methods. Why? Because assessment carries enormous responsibility. Assessments determine grades. Grades influence scholarships and surface opportunities for exposure and professional practice. Scholarships and exposure influence careers. In other words, assessment systems must be trusted. And once an evaluation method becomes widely accepted, institutions tend to be cautious about changing it. In STEM education, this caution has been especially strong. Engineering, physics, mathematics, these disciplines depend heavily on rigorous standards. Students must demonstrate competence, not just familiarity, which means instructors often rely on evaluation methods that have proven reliable over time. Even when new technologies become available, educators frequently ask a critical question: can we trust this system to fairly evaluate students? Within the context of what we are encountering now in 2026, can we accredit a doctor with a license to practice medicine or award a professional designation to an engineer based on an AI engine's assessment of their competence in their given art? That question slows change. And that caution in many ways is understandable because we don't yet have the data or experience to provide that universal confidence. But it also creates an interesting paradox. The technologies that transform teaching often struggle to transform assessment. Consider modern learning platforms, and I'm going to speak authoritatively to what our platform Mobius offers, but some of these apply to a number of other systems as well. Students can now receive immediate feedback on practice problems. Interactive simulations allow them to experiment with complex systems. AI tools can explain concepts and guide problem solving. All of these tools can dramatically enhance learning. But when it comes time to evaluate students, many instructors still rely on traditional exams. Why? Because assessment requires something more than instructional support. It requires credibility. An assessment must be trusted by the instructor, the institution, the accreditation body, and often the broader profession and the public at large that seeks service from this profession. In fields like engineering or medicine, that trust matters enormously. A degree signals competence. Now, whether or not that is universally accurate, that is what has been ingrained in society for centuries. And institutions want to ensure that competence is demonstrated in reliable ways, which means assessment evolves cautiously. But that doesn't mean we won't evolve at all. And that's where the signal appears. While traditional exams remain common, subtle changes are already emerging. Many STEM courses now include continuous assessment. Instead of relying on a few major exams, instructors evaluate learning through multiple smaller activities, practice assignments, online problem sets, interactive exercises, collaborative projects. These tools allow instructors to observe learning over time rather than at isolated moments. At the same time, digital assessment platforms can evaluate complex problem solving more efficiently than ever before. Some systems allow students to explore multiple solution paths. Others provide targeted feedback that helps learners understand mistakes immediately. And increasingly, assessment is beginning to incorporate authentic problem solving, adding realistic scenarios, having engineering design challenges, data analysis tasks, problems that more closely resemble the work professionals actually do. In other words, the future of assessment may not abandon rigor, but it may gradually expand how competence is demonstrated, from single moments of evaluation to richer, ongoing demonstrations of understanding. And that brings us back to the curio. Why does STEM assessment still resemble its mid-20th century counterpart? Perhaps because assessment systems carry enormous responsibility. They must balance innovation with fairness, flexibility with trust. But the story of assessment is still unfolding. Technology is beginning to provide new ways to observe learning, and over time, these tools may allow educators to evaluate understanding more continuously and perhaps more authentically than they ever have before. Education technology evolves quickly, but the patterns of learning change slowly. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for joining me in exploring the EdTech Curio Cabinet.